The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Not the ordinary silence that settled before a televised case began, but something heavier. Something expectant. The producers noticed it first. The camera crew spoke in lower voices. Even the audience, usually eager for confrontation and chaos, seemed restrained, whispering carefully as though they already sensed they were about to witness something different. Judge Judy's courtroom had seen celebrities before. Athletes. Influencers. Millionaires who believed money could bend accountability. But this felt different. Because the name written across the morning docket carried a kind of gravity that changed the air before a single word was spoken. Barron Trump. The whispers spread almost instantly the moment the doors opened. That's really him? He actually showed up? I thought this was just internet gossip. But then he walked in, tall, composed, dressed in a dark navy suit that looked almost too formal for daytime television. He didn't look toward the cameras. Didn't acknowledge the murmuring audience. He simply walked calmly toward the defendant's table carrying a thin black folder beneath his arm. What surprised people wasn't arrogance. It was restraint. Most young men entering a courtroom surrounded by cameras either tried too hard to appear confident or looked visibly overwhelmed. Barron did neither. His expression remained unreadable, almost distant, but not cold. Controlled. Like someone who had spent years learning how to exist under observation without reacting to it. A producer near the front quietly muttered, "He looks more prepared than half the attorneys we get in here." Another shook her head slowly. "Yeah, but Judy's still Judy." The case itself sounded simple on paper. A dispute involving a luxury property contract tied to a Manhattan real estate consulting firm. The plaintiff, a middle-aged businessman named Leonard Grayson, claimed Barron had interfered with a private agreement involving a high-value lease arrangement, allegedly causing financial damages worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But almost immediately, people sensed the paperwork wasn't the real story. The real story was the tension sitting quietly between expectation and reality. Because everyone expected Barron Trump to behave one way. And within minutes he had already done the opposite. Then the side door opened. Judge Judy entered with her usual pace, sharp-eyed and composed, her robe flowing behind her as the courtroom rose to its feet. Everyone except Barron stood immediately. But unlike the arrogance viewers often associated with wealthy defendants, Barron rose half a second later, seemingly distracted while organizing documents inside his folder. It was brief. But Judy noticed. Her eyes lifted toward him for only a moment before she sat down. "Be seated." The audience obeyed instantly. Judy adjusted the papers on her desk, scanning the case file with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades separating truth from performance. But as her eyes reached the defendant's name, there was the slightest pause. Not surprise. Recognition. "Mr. Trump," she said calmly, "I assume you understand this is a courtroom, not a press conference." A faint ripple of nervous laughter spread through the gallery. Barron nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice surprised people too. Measured. Oh, calm. Not rehearsed. Not defensive. Judy leaned back slightly. "Good. Then we won't waste each other's time." Most defendants would have stopped there. Nodded nervously. Stayed quiet. But Barron opened his folder carefully and spoke again. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, "I also don't intend to let assumptions replace evidence." The room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Subtly. But everyone felt it. The audience straightened. One cameraman slowly zoomed closer. Even Leonard Grayson glanced sideways now, studying Barron differently. Because that sentence hadn't sounded emotional. It sounded prepared. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger. Interest. "Assumptions?" she repeated. Barron folded his hands calmly on the table. "My last name tends to create them." A few murmurs moved through the crowd. Judy studied him for a long moment without speaking. She had spent years dismantling arrogance in her courtroom, and she recognized its patterns instantly. Loud voices. Forced confidence. Deflection disguised as intelligence. But this wasn't that. This felt different. More dangerous. Because confidence without emotion was harder to read. Mr. Grayson immediately jumped in, clearly irritated. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I warned everybody about. He talks like he's above accountability." Barron didn't even look at him. Instead, he calmly slid a document across the table. "No," he said quietly. "I talk like someone who brought evidence." That line landed harder than anyone expected. The audience fell completely silent. Judge Judy glanced toward the paper now resting near the clerk's desk. Then back toward Barron. For the first time that morning, her expression shifted slightly. Not frustration. Curiosity. And somewhere behind the courtroom cameras, one producer whispered softly under her breath, "Oh, this is about to get interesting." The silence that followed Barron Trump's final sentence lingered longer than anyone expected. In most courtrooms, silence meant uncertainty. In Judge Judy's courtroom, silence usually meant someone had just made a mistake. But this felt different. It felt like the room itself was trying to decide what kind of story it had just stepped into. Judge Judy lowered her eyes toward the document Barron had slid across the table. Her fingers rested lightly against the paper, but she didn't read it immediately. Instead, she studied him first. That alone unsettled the audience. Because Judy rarely hesitated. Over decades on television, viewers had become used to watching her dominate the rhythm of every case. She controlled the pace, the pressure, the emotional temperature of the room. Yet now, for the second time that morning, Barron had interrupted that rhythm without raising his voice once. Mr. Grayson noticed it too. "That paper doesn't change the facts," he snapped quickly, leaning forward in his seat. "Your Honor, this whole thing is exactly what wealthy people do. They complicate everything so nobody can hold them responsible." Barron finally turned toward him. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just calmly. "The facts are already complicated," he replied. "I'm simply the first person here willing to read all of them." Another murmur spread through the gallery. Judge Judy finally picked up the document. Her eyes scanned the first page silently while the courtroom waited. The only sound came from the faint hum of studio lights overhead and the distant scratching of a reporter's pen somewhere near the back row. Then Judy looked up again. "Mr. Trump," she said evenly, "this agreement appears to contain an amendment." Barron nodded once. "Page 4, Your Honor." Judy flipped the page carefully. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, Leonard Grayson's confidence visibly flickered. It was small. Barely noticeable. But Judy caught it immediately. "So," she continued slowly, "according to this amendment, the original lease conditions were altered 3 weeks before the dispute." "That's correct," Barron said. Grayson leaned forward quickly. That amendment was informal. Barron's expression never changed. It was signed. It wasn't finalized. It was notarized. The room tightened again. Judy's eyes moved sharply toward Grayson now. Was it notarized? Grayson hesitated. "Technically yes, but..." Judy interrupted. He swallowed slightly. But the intent of the agreement remained unchanged. Barron finally opened another section of his folder. His movements were precise, almost unnervingly calm for someone sitting under national scrutiny. "With respect," he said quietly, "intent becomes difficult to argue once signatures are involved." The audience reacted immediately this time. Not loudly, but enough for the tension to shift again. People had expected entitlement. What they were seeing instead looked dangerously close to preparation. Judge Judy leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes narrowing with interest. "You've spent a lot of time studying this case." Barron met her gaze directly. "I learned a long time ago that people tend to underestimate preparation when they've already decided who you are." That line landed differently. Not arrogant. Personal. For the first time, the courtroom stopped looking at him like a headline and started looking at him like a person. Judy noticed that too. Most defendants either crumbled under pressure or fought emotionally against it. Barron was doing neither. He wasn't trying to overpower the courtroom. He was simply refusing to lose control inside it. Mr. Grayson, however, was beginning to lose his. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "He's turning this into some kind of performance." Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the plaintiff's evidence stack sitting near the clerk. Then back at Grayson. "The performance started long before I arrived." The room froze. Grayson's face tightened instantly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Barron replied calmly, "your timeline doesn't match your invoices." Judy's attention sharpened instantly. "What invoices?" Barron reached into the folder again and removed several printed pages. "The repair invoices submitted in Exhibit C. The dates overlap with occupancy records showing the property was still in active use." Grayson's expression changed immediately now. Panic. Very brief. But real. Judy extended her hand toward the clerk. "Let me see those." The clerk quickly passed the documents forward while the audience leaned in almost collectively. The energy in the room had changed completely now. This was no longer about a famous name appearing in court. This was becoming something else. An intellectual battle. And for the first time that morning, viewers could sense Judge Judy recalibrating her approach in real time. Her eyes scanned the invoices carefully. Then she looked toward Grayson. "These dates are inconsistent." Grayson straightened quickly. "There's an explanation for that." "I'm listening." He hesitated. Barron remained perfectly still beside him. No smug smile. No interruption. Which somehow made the pressure even worse. Judy noticed that too. Because calmness under pressure often revealed more than aggression ever could. "Mr. Grayson?" she repeated. The plaintiff cleared his throat. The renovations were scheduled before occupancy officially ended. Judy's expression didn't change. But the invoices claimed the work was completed afterward. Another silence. Longer this time. The audience could practically feel the case shifting beneath them. Then Judy slowly turned back toward Barron. "You anticipated this inconsistency." Barron nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." "How?" He paused briefly before answering. "Because the numbers made more sense than the story." That line hit the courtroom like a quiet explosion. Even the producers behind the cameras exchanged looks now. This wasn't unfolding like ordinary television conflict anymore. There was no shouting. No dramatic outburst. Just pressure. Precise, controlled pressure. And somehow that felt even more intense. Judge Judy folded her hands together slowly. "You seem unusually comfortable in this courtroom, Mr. Trump." For the first time, Barron allowed the faintest hint of emotion to cross his face. Not confidence. Recognition. "I've spent most of my life in rooms where people already made conclusions before I spoke," he said quietly. "Eventually you learn preparation is the only thing they can't argue with." The courtroom fell completely silent again. And this time, even Judge Judy didn't interrupt it immediately. Because somewhere beneath the legal documents and television cameras, something unexpected had begun to emerge. Respect. But Judy wasn't ready to show it yet. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but sharper now. "Well," she said softly, "let's see how prepared you really are." And just like that, the real battle began. By the time the courtroom returned from its short recess, the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier that morning, people had arrived expecting entertainment. Another viral courtroom clip. Another wealthy defendant getting dismantled under Judge Judy's pressure. But now the energy felt heavier. Sharper. Like everyone suddenly understood they were watching something more complicated unfold. The audience leaned forward quietly as Judge Judy re-entered the courtroom. This time even the producers weren't whispering. Barron Trump remained seated at the defense table exactly as he had been before recess, one hand resting calmly against the closed black folder beside him. He hadn't spent the break pacing nervously like most defendants. He hadn't made phone calls. Hadn't tried to charm the audience or speak to reporters outside. He had simply sat there. Waiting. And strangely, that composure was beginning to unsettle people more than arrogance ever could. Judge Judy sat down slowly, adjusting her glasses as her eyes moved across the courtroom. "Let's continue." Her tone was calm. But different now. More focused. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat immediately, trying to regain momentum before Barron could speak again. "Your Honor, I think we're losing sight of the actual issue here. This young man breached an agreement and caused substantial financial damage. Instead of addressing that directly, he keeps redirecting attention toward paperwork technicalities." Barron finally looked toward him again. "Contracts are paperwork technicalities," he replied quietly. A few people in the audience laughed before immediately silencing themselves. Judge Judy didn't smile. But her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Trump," she said carefully, "you seem very confident for someone without formal legal training." Barron folded his hands together calmly. "You don't need formal training to recognize inconsistencies." "Maybe not," Judy replied. "But confidence and understanding are not always the same thing." For the first time all morning, Barron paused slightly before answering. And somehow that hesitation made the room even quieter. Then he spoke. "With respect, Your Honor, I agree completely." That response surprised her. The audience expected defensiveness. Instead, Barron continued calmly. "That's why I reviewed every page 3 times before coming here. Because assumptions are dangerous when cameras are involved." Judy studied him closely now. Not as a celebrity defendant. As a puzzle. "You keep mentioning assumptions. Because they matter." "Explain." Barron glanced briefly toward the audience before returning his attention to Judy. "The moment my name appeared on the docket," he said quietly, "people stopped expecting evidence and started expecting a story." The room fell silent again. No one moved. Because everybody knew he was right. Judge Judy leaned back slightly in her chair. "And what story do you think they expected?" Barron's answer came immediately. That I'd either act entitled, or collapse under pressure. Mr. Grayson scoffed loudly. You want sympathy now? Barron ignored him completely. That was beginning to frustrate the plaintiff more than direct confrontation would have. Judy noticed it too. In fact, she was noticing everything now. The restraint. The discipline. The deliberate refusal to lose emotional control. It reminded her of experienced attorneys she'd encountered over decades on the bench. Not because Barron spoke like a lawyer, but because he understood something many people never learned. Emotion changes perception. And the calmer person usually controls the room. Judy opened the revised contract documents again. There's still something bothering me, she said slowly. Barron nodded once. The timeline. Her eyes lifted immediately. You anticipated that too. The renovation invoices don't just overlap with occupancy records, Barron explained calmly. They overlap with security access logs. Mr. Grayson's face changed instantly. And this time the audience noticed. Judge Judy noticed too. Security logs? She repeated. Barron reached into the folder beside him again and removed another document packet. Building entry records from the property management company. The clerk collected them quickly and handed them forward. As Judy began reading, the silence inside the courtroom became unbearable. Mr. Grayson shifted visibly in his seat now. His earlier confidence was disappearing fast. These records, Judy said carefully, show maintenance crews entering the property before the damages were officially documented. Barron nodded. Yes, Your Honor. That would mean the condition of the property may have changed before the inspection occurred. Mr. Grayson interrupted immediately. That's speculation. No, Barron replied softly. That's timestamps. The audience reacted again. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for the tension to become physical. Judge Judy slowly removed her glasses. That almost never happened unless something significant had shifted. She looked directly at Grayson now. Did you disclose these access records during filing? The plaintiff hesitated. And hesitation inside Judy's courtroom was dangerous. We didn't think they were relevant. Barron finally spoke before Judy could respond. They became relevant the moment damages were used to assign liability. Grayson turned sharply toward him. You think you know everything because you memorized a few documents? For the first time all morning, Barron's expression hardened slightly. Not anger. Something quieter. More personal. No, he said calmly. I learned to memorize documents because people rarely listen once they recognize my last name. That line hit the room harder than anything else he had said. Even Judge Judy went still for a moment. Because suddenly the case wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about perception, pressure, identity, and the strange burden of entering every room already misunderstood. Judy studied him carefully now, almost as if reassessing the entire morning from the beginning. Most people who lived under public scrutiny eventually developed one of two habits: aggression or performance. Barron had developed neither. Instead, he had become controlled, precise, careful. And that made him far more difficult to dismiss. The audience sensed it too. Somewhere near the back row, one woman whispered quietly to her husband, "He's not fighting her, he's forcing everyone to slow down." That was exactly what was happening. Judge Judy looked back down at the evidence again. Then something caught her attention. A tiny detail buried inside the security logs. Her eyes narrowed immediately. Barron noticed. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, their silence toward each other felt almost mutual. Judy slowly lifted one page higher. These access records, she said softly. Why does this employee ID appear after the property was supposedly vacant? Mr. Grayson froze. Completely. Barron didn't answer immediately this time. He simply watched. And somehow that silence felt louder than any accusation. Judge Judy looked up slowly now, her voice calm but suddenly much colder. Mr. Grayson, she said carefully, I think you need to explain something. The courtroom stopped breathing. Because everyone could feel it. The case had just changed. Completely. The courtroom remained completely still after Judge Judy's question. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody whispered. Even the usual rustling of papers had stopped. It was the kind of silence that only happened when everyone sensed the truth standing just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to pull it into the light. Mr. Grayson swallowed hard. Judge Judy noticed immediately. Over decades on the bench, she had developed an instinct for the exact moment confidence turned into calculation. And right now, Leonard Grayson no longer looked irritated. He looked cornered. Judy held up the security log again. This employee access card, she said carefully, was used 48 hours after the property was officially declared vacant. Grayson shifted in his chair. There's probably a simple explanation. Barron remained silent beside him. That silence was beginning to feel strategic now. Judy's eyes sharpened. Good. Then give me one. Another pause. Too long. The audience felt it immediately. Grayson glanced briefly toward his attorney seated behind him, but even the attorney avoided eye contact now. That was all Judy needed to see. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Grayson, were workers still entering the property after the alleged damage inspection? No. Barron finally spoke quietly. The logs say otherwise. Grayson turned sharply toward him. You've been trying to manipulate this case from the beginning. Barron didn't react emotionally. No. I've been trying to understand why the timeline kept changing. That line landed heavily. Because deep down, everyone in the room had started noticing the same thing. Every time evidence appeared, the plaintiff's story shifted slightly to accommodate it. Judge Judy lowered the papers onto her desk slowly. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Mr. Grayson, who exactly took the original damage photographs? The plaintiff blinked rapidly. Our inspection team. Names? Another hesitation. Barron finally opened his folder again and removed a final set of documents. This time, even the producers behind the cameras leaned forward. Because they could sense it now. The reveal. The inspection report, Barron said calmly, lists the photographs as being submitted by a subcontracted maintenance consultant. Judy extended her hand immediately. Let me see that. The clerk passed the papers forward while the audience watched almost breathlessly. Judy's eyes moved across the page. Then stopped. Slowly she looked back toward Grayson. This consultant, she said carefully, is also connected to your property management company. Grayson's face lost color instantly. That doesn't mean anything. Barron finally looked directly at him again. It means the inspection was not independent. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Judge Judy raised one hand sharply for silence, but the atmosphere had already changed completely. This was no longer a disagreement over property damages. This was beginning to look like manipulation. Judy turned back toward Grayson. Did you disclose this relationship during filing? His voice tightened. It wasn't necessary. Judy's expression hardened instantly. Oh, I think it was. The tension inside the room became unbearable now. Grayson wiped his forehead nervously. Your Honor, this is being exaggerated. No, Judy replied calmly. What's being exaggerated are your damages. The audience reacted immediately. Even Barron looked slightly surprised by how directly she said it. Judy continued reviewing the documents carefully. Then suddenly she stopped again. Another detail. Another inconsistency. Her eyes narrowed sharply. These repair invoices, she said slowly. Some of these charges were approved before the inspection date. Grayson froze. Completely. Barron remained perfectly still. And somehow that stillness made the moment even more devastating. Judy looked up now, her voice quieter than before. Dangerously quiet. So let me understand this correctly, she said. You approved renovation expenses before officially documenting the damages you blamed on the defendant. Grayson's mouth opened but nothing came out. The courtroom exploded into whispers again. People weren't just shocked anymore. They were realizing they may have judged the wrong person from the beginning. Judge Judy removed her glasses slowly and placed them onto the bench. That gesture alone made the room tense instantly. Because viewers knew what it meant. She was done entertaining excuses. Mr. Grayson, she said carefully, did you attempt to inflate damages using renovations that were already scheduled before this dispute? No. But this time even his own voice sounded uncertain. Barron finally spoke again. Still calm. Still controlled. The renovation permits were filed 12 days before the alleged incident. Judy's eyes lifted sharply. You have the permits? Barron nodded once. They're public record. The audience audibly gasped. Even the clerk looked stunned now. Because suddenly the entire case made horrifying sense. The damages. The rushed filing. The inconsistent timelines. The manipulated inspection process. All of it pointed toward one possibility. This case may never have been about property damage at all. It may have been about finding someone powerful enough to blame. Mr. Grayson's composure finally cracked completely. This is insane, he snapped loudly. You're all acting like I'm some criminal. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. That somehow made her response even colder. No, she said quietly. I'm acting like someone who doesn't appreciate manipulated evidence in my courtroom." The room fell silent again. Barron lowered his eyes briefly toward the table, almost as though he was finally allowing himself to breathe for the first time all morning. But Judy noticed something else too. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't enjoying this. That mattered to her. Because truly arrogant people celebrated when others collapsed. Barron looked almost tired instead. Like someone accustomed to fighting assumptions long before entering any courtroom. Judy studied him carefully for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You knew this case would turn into something larger the moment your name became attached to it." Barron hesitated briefly, then nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. And yet you still came here personally." This time his answer came softer. "If I didn't," he said quietly, "people would assume the accusations were true." That sentence changed the room completely. Because suddenly everyone understood something uncomfortable. This case had never just been about evidence. It had been about perception. The power of public assumptions. The danger of narratives people wanted to believe before facts ever appeared. Judge Judy leaned back slowly in her chair. Then she looked directly at Barron again. And for the first time all day, her voice carried something unexpected. Respect. "You know," she said carefully, "most people in your position either rely on reputation or hide behind it." Barron remained silent. "But you did neither." The audience watched quietly now. No whispers. No laughter. Just attention. Judy folded her hands together slowly. "Instead," she continued, "you came prepared." Then she turned sharply back toward Mr. Grayson. "And that preparation may have just exposed a very serious problem with your entire case." The courtroom went completely still. Because everybody knew what was coming next. The collapse. The courtroom no longer felt like a television set. By the final stage of the hearing, the atmosphere had transformed into something quieter, heavier, almost reflective. Earlier that morning, people had entered expecting spectacle. They expected power, privilege, confrontation. They expected another famous last name walking into Judge Judy's courtroom believing influence could replace accountability. Instead, they had watched something entirely different unfold. And now, as silence settled across the room once more, even the cameras seemed less intrusive. Judge Judy sat motionless behind the bench, the stack of documents spread carefully before her. Her expression remained calm, but there was a finality in her posture now. The kind of stillness that appears right before a decision changes everything. Mr. Grayson looked nothing like the confident businessman who had entered the courtroom hours earlier. His tie hung slightly loose now. His posture had collapsed inward. Every attempt to regain control had only revealed more inconsistencies, more contradictions, more evidence that the story presented to the court was never fully truthful. Barron Trump remained seated quietly beside his folder, hands folded calmly in front of him. No celebration. No visible satisfaction. Just composure. Judge Judy finally broke the silence. After reviewing the submitted evidence, she began carefully, "This court has serious concerns regarding the credibility of the plaintiff's claims." The room tightened immediately. Judy continued. "The inspection timeline is inconsistent. The renovation invoices conflict with occupancy records. Security logs contradict the stated sequence of events. And most importantly, critical relationships tied to the inspection process were not properly disclosed." Each sentence landed like a measured strike. Not emotional. Precise. Mr. Grayson opened his mouth slightly. "Your Honor, I..." Judy raised her hand immediately. "No. You've spoken enough." Silence again. The audience barely moved now. "This courtroom," Judy continued calmly, "operates on evidence, not assumptions. And what concerns me most is that assumptions appear to have played a very large role in why this case was filed the way it was." Her eyes shifted briefly toward Barron. Not dramatically. But everyone noticed. "Because once a famous name enters a courtroom," she said slowly, "people stop expecting nuance. They stop expecting facts. The narrative becomes more attractive than the truth." Barron lowered his eyes briefly toward the table. For the first time all day he looked affected by something deeper than pressure. Judge Judy noticed that too. Then she turned back toward the plaintiff. "Mr. Grayson, this court finds your evidence unreliable and your damages unsupported by the timeline presented. Therefore your claim is dismissed." The room erupted instantly. Gasp. Murmurs. Reporters scribbling furiously. Even the producers behind the cameras exchanged stunned looks. But Judy wasn't finished yet. "And furthermore," she continued sharply, I strongly suggest you reconsider how casually you attached allegations to someone whose public identity already guarantees scrutiny before facts are even examined. Grayson looked stunned. You're making it sound like he's the victim here. Judy's response came instantly. No, she said calmly. I'm saying accountability applies equally. To wealthy people. To powerful people. And to people who think public perception is a substitute for proof. The room fell silent again. Barron finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom. And for the first time that day there was no tension between them anymore. Only understanding. Judy leaned back slightly in her chair. You know, Mr. Trump, she said carefully, when this case began I expected one thing. Barron remained silent. I expected defensiveness. Maybe entitlement. Maybe someone relying on reputation instead of responsibility. A few people in the audience shifted quietly. But that's not what happened. Barron spoke softly. No, Your Honor. Judy nodded once. Instead, you did something most people fail to do under pressure. She paused briefly. You prepared. The room remained completely still now. Because everyone understood this moment wasn't really about legal documents anymore. It was about perception. About assumptions. About how quickly people decided who someone was before they even spoke. Judy folded her hands together carefully. Your name may open doors, she said quietly, but today preparation spoke louder than reputation. That line seemed to settle over the entire courtroom at once. Even the audience looked different now. Earlier, many had watched Barron with suspicion, curiosity, or expectation. But those emotions had slowly transformed into something more complicated. Respect. Not because he had won, but because he never lost control trying to. Mr. Grayson shook his head bitterly. This whole thing became political the second his name entered the case. No, Judy replied calmly. It became emotional. There's a difference. The silence afterward felt enormous. Barron finally gathered the papers inside his folder carefully. His movements remained controlled, but there was something subtly different in his expression now. Not triumph. Relief. Like someone who had spent years understanding that every room came with expectations attached before he even entered it. Judge Judy watched him quietly for a moment longer. Then she spoke one final time. Mr. Trump. Barron looked up. People will spend your entire life deciding who you are before they know anything about you. She paused. Your responsibility is deciding whether you let that define you. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Barron nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. And somehow, those 3 words carried more sincerity than anything else said all day. Judy gave a small nod back. Good. She gathered the final papers together neatly. This case is dismissed. Her gavel struck once. Sure. Cling. Final. The audience erupted into applause almost immediately, but Judy ignored it. She always did. Because for her, the courtroom was never about performance. It was about balance. About separating emotion from evidence long enough for truth to survive. Barron stood slowly, buttoning his jacket calmly as reporters rushed toward the exits outside the courtroom doors. Headlines would explode within hours. Barron Trump shocks Judge Judy. Courtroom reversal nobody expected. Judge Judy defends fairness over assumptions. But inside the courtroom itself, the ending felt quieter than the headlines ever would. Because what people witnessed wasn't arrogance defeating authority. It was composure surviving pressure. As Barron turned toward the exit, Judge Judy glanced once toward her clerk beside the bench. Well, the clerk whispered softly, that wasn't what anybody expected. Judy allowed the faintest smile to cross her face. No, she replied quietly. But truth rarely is. And as the courtroom lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, the lesson lingered long after the case itself ended. Because in the end it wasn't fame, power, or politics that controlled the courtroom that day. It was preparation. It was restraint. And in a room full of assumptions, the calmest person became the hardest one to defeat.